Well, hello plant lovers. It is Matthew in Melbourne welcoming you to my channel, which is called Hello Plant Lovers, because I try to grow cold, cool, intermediate orchids here in Melbourne, Australia, without any help from anyone. Sometimes I wish I did, but I don't have a greenhouse or heat or humidifiers or grow lights, really just me and them figuring out how to grow together inside or outside, or they die. It's like the Hunger Games. So if that sounds like your growing conditions, hit subscribe. I post every week on a Friday. My ramblings are amateur, but they might help you. And yes, what is before me but this glorious flower, which is, of course, a Masdevallia. So why not? Let's make a Masdevallia video. And I have got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 flowers on this plant. It makes my heart sing. Now, before we go any further, this is Masdevallia coccinea Alba form, and it's a cross between Snowtree and Blanca, which means it's white. And I accidentally bought 2 of these because why have one when you can have 2? Now, I have made a care video about Masdevallia before, but it's a few years later. And this time last year, well, in fact, 11 months ago, I made a video with Dan, who is a bit of a specialist Sarcochilis grower, and I'll link that video here. And he very kindly showed me his shade house because we're filming Sarcochilis. Now, we filmed that in October last year. It's September now, so my Sarcochilis are still budding. Gives you an idea of the time frame though. So it was sort of mid-ish spring when I went to visit him, and there was a sea of Masdevallia all at the lowest level of his shade house. So I said, can I just quickly film a little piece about Masdevallia with you as well? And he said, sure. So let's just do a quick recap of what Masdevallia is, and then we're going to head over to Dan. So Masdevallia, named after Dr. Jose Masdeval. So he was an 18th century botanist, and the first sort of discovered species was named in the late 18th century after him. So they're a New World orchid, meaning they're from the Americas, so from sort of Mexico down into South America. And mostly they are cloud forest plants. Now, cloud forest plants do very well in Melbourne. A lot of Himalayan cloud forest plants do very well here. So they're described as epiphytes and sometimes lithophytes, and have been described as being growing by the side of the road. So they're that sort of epiphyte, and there are epiphytes and epiphytes and epiphytes, as there are many sorts of plants, that will sort of grow on moss and in accumulated matter that builds up. So they have quite fine roots, and they will just occupy that mossy, slightly fibrous knoll that can build up. So in the bark on a tree, or in the crevice of a rock, or by the side of the road on a rock. But essentially epiphytes with a hint of lithophytic / terrestrialness in the mix. Now, they have very fine roots, but what you can see from this plant is that they have no pseudobulbs. So you see, the leaf just comes out of a bit of a sort of a creeping rhizome. So a plant with that structure will give you the clue that a pseudobulb evolved to store water. So you can assume, I think, ergo, that a plant that doesn't have pseudobulbs doesn't need to store water. And why would that be? Yes, because it comes from a place with lots of moisture. So those cloudy mountainous forests are just that. You can imagine all of that sort of mist, a lot of precipitation, very moist soil, lots of humidity, not warm, but just all of that moisture in the air, which means that those fine roots never get dry, which means the plant doesn't need to store water because it has access to water all year. Which means, and we'll get to that in care in a minute, you got to be careful about how you look after them. So the flowers always sort of look like that sort of beautiful trifecta shape. This one is the Alba form of coccinea, but obviously that would suggest the name coccinea, that it's red, but you can get reds, orange, pink, purple, white, everything in between. There are ones with stripes too. Lots of hybridization has been going on with Masdevallias, and they are just stunning. And the ones I think that are strong monochromes, like hot magenta and hot orange and white, look incredible when they're in bloom. Enough about mine though. Let's go back in time to 11 months ago to Dan, and Dan is a veterinarian and a great orchidist. So thank you, Dan, for your time once again. So let's go and look at his Masdevallia this time last year. Now, Dan, the other thing that you're growing very successfully with your Sarcochilis, which amazes me, is
Yeah,
Masdevallia.
yeah.
Now, I'm amazed that the sarks can take the same light,
Yep.
but they do,
Yep.
and they're living their best life.
Yep.
So give me your top tips for Masdevallia growing in Melbourne. I mean, look at this. This is the species, and that is...
Ignea.
Ignea.
Yeah, so these are two forms of Ignea.
Absolutely
My
beautiful.
favourite species.
I find that a lot of plants from mountainous regions
Yep.
do very well in Melbourne.
Yep. Yep.
So what are your tips? Temperature.
Temperature.
Because
Cool.
as the Sarcochilas can deal with the heat,
Yep.
these can't. But your plants seem fine. What do you do?
So I guess in Melbourne, where it gets really hot in summer, up to 40 degrees, they're really low to the ground. So that helps. On a really, really hot day, if we're getting a run of 40+ degree days, these igneas don't love it. So I actually have just a tray of igneas that I take inside.
Right.
But the hybrids are pretty good. The hybrids stay outside all year and I don't move them. Again, just lots of water. Their roots really need to stay healthy in really fresh open mix. So I think if the mix is looking like it's starting to degrade, the plant needs to be tipped out and all the mix taken off and fresh mix put in.
And how often would you repot them?
Probably
do you do it regularly regardless, or do you read the plant?
Probably read the plant, but probably every 2 or 3 years.
Okay.
Would be ideal.
And your mix seems to me quite light. So
yes, so this is the same. This is the Orchiata mix, the same mix I would use for the sarks.
Yeah.
For these little tubes, this is the smaller mix. So this is 6 to 9 millimeters.
Oh yeah.
And the bigger one is 9 to 12 millimeters.
Yeah.
But again, they want lots of moisture. So yeah, nice open mix, but something that holds a bit of moisture.
So no sphagnum in there?
No, I don't. I think it's too shady and too cool in here for sphagnum. I think they just would rot.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting, interesting. What's your feeding regime? I want to just hold up another one
Yeah.
because they're so beautiful. So what is your feeding regime? Look at this. Now I'm going to tell everyone, if I can, what this hybrid is. This is Sundancer Peats Ridge. There we are. Amazing. So fertilizing, given that this is an orchid that really can grow all year and it doesn't have pseudobulbs.
Yeah. I, again, feed it with everything else. So spring, summer, autumn, just a liquid high potassium fertilizer that I use for all the orchids. So nothing different.
And a high potassium fertilizer, because I don't go down the rabbit hole or something.
Me either.
But that would be something that you'd use for tomatoes or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, probably not dissimilar, or roses even.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That is stunning. Well, I am also amazed that they are just so healthy and vigorous and all in bloom. I will have to confess that only 2 of mine are in bloom at the moment.
And these,
so
shame. These you could potentially grow inside too. A bright south in the southern hemisphere, south-facing windowsill.
Which would be northern facing in the northern hemisphere. So they do well.
Yeah, they would grow.
And pests, Dan, I can see a little bit.
Yeah, snails. The caterpillars also love the new growths.
Yeah.
So anything that likes fleshy leaves is going to eat these.
But otherwise,
pretty good.
Yeah, fairly tough. Well, brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for Masdevallia.
No worries.
So that was the surprising thing for me, that they were basically in the same space as his Sarcochilas. Now, Sarcochilas are an Australian orchid which does not come from misty mountain tops, far from it, although some species can, but anyway, generalisation, they don't, and need quite different care. Sarcochilas will need more light, and although Dan waters his a lot, they can take dry periods. Masdevallia can't, but Dan's point was his are lower down in his shade house, so they are cooler and moister down there. Now it's interesting, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was at the Orchid Society Council of Victoria's grand annual Orchid Spectacular, and there was quite a famous Masdevallia grower there, and I'll just quickly show you the footage from their stand. So I always ask people, what's your care tips? Their care tip is always repot every year. So they repot their plants every year without fail. Dan, as you heard, repots his when he feels that the medium is a bit tired or when the plant is demonstrating that it needs it. And let's consult some books about Masdevallia. Now this is Growing Orchids, book 3 by J.N. Rintoul. It's a series of amazing orchid books actually, and I got all of them from a secondhand bookshop in Hobart in Tasmania. So Dan repots his whenever he feels they need it. The specialist grower I met at the Orchid Spectacular repots theirs religiously every year. J.N. Rintoul says pot drainage should be perfect as Masdevallias prefer to grow undisturbed for some years. and Exotic Orchids in Australia by David L. Jones, another book I got from a secondhand shop, says Masdevallias should not be overpotted and some growers repot annually in a mix from fern fibre or chopped sphagnum moss or fine particles of bark. I think what we can conclude is that with any grower, when you ask how do they grow things, you'll get a different response from everyone. And that's the thing about growing orchids. You've got to figure out what works for you and what you want to do. There is kind of no right and wrong way. The only thing to bear in mind are some of those key conditions, such as it will not thrive if you dry it out. It's not an orchid that wants to dry out. But as long as you bear that in mind, what you pot it in and how often is kind of up to you and how healthy or not the plant is looking. So I came back from the Orchid Spectacular thinking, I've got to repot all my Masdevallias. Some of them have been in the same mix for years. And then I listened to Dan just now before I filmed this bit. And then I looked at this plant and just looked at all the wonderful new growth and the flowers that are on it, thinking, well, that plant looks healthy enough. The leaves are glorious. There's no spots on them. The flowers are healthy. I don't need to repot that. So I was going to do a bit of repotting in this video as well, but A, it is so cold and miserable, I just don't want to go outside and get wet and cold and miserable. And B, I just need to look at each plant and decide if each one actually needs to be repotted. And what do you pot them in? So we just read there that people will use fern fibre, coconut fibre will be very similar, bark, sphagnum moss, and Dan just uses a medium-sized bark, and I use a mix of bark and sphagnum. Now, all of the books do say that the roots are very fine and they are prone to rotting, so it wants to be kept moist but not wet all the time because the roots will rot. So I guess to Dan's point, if you've got sphagnum moss in there, there's more chance that the roots can rot. But it really depends where you are and what your ambient temperature's like. Now, these are all cool growing orchids because they grow from high altitude, misty forests in the Andes, well, in South America, from Mexico down. The hot spot, though, for them is the high Andes in sort of Peru and Colombia. So they do need cool temperatures, cool nighttime temperatures particularly. They can take occasional heat. So Dan takes his indoors, I don't. And we can sometimes get to 40 degrees centigrade here, so over 100 Fahrenheit quite easily and relatively often. I just make sure that I water everything morning and afternoon on a day like that and create lots of humidity around everything, and they're kind of okay. So saying though, I was going to make this video last year when all mine were in bud, and then I had a few cataclysmic experiences. One was a blast of heat, really dry heat, and all the buds just wilted and died, and that was that. The next thing is slugs and snails. Now they, which Dan also referenced, love Masdevallias. I think out of any of my orchids, actually Masdevallia and Sarcochilas, funnily enough, because they're the two things that Dan grows together. So the slugs and snails with my Sarcochilas have eaten the flower spikes when they're really young and juicy, and they've done the same thing with my Masdevallia, but they've actually eaten the flower when the spike was quite advanced. They've also, as you can see on this one, love a little bit of, and this probably was a caterpillar, munching of a leaf. So munching insects love my Masdevallias because I grow them outdoors all year, so they are exposed to a lot of that wildlife. Now, back to this book about potting. This is hilarious because you just get different advice from everyone. Although classed as epiphytes, Masdevallias have a root system which is moderately coarse and prolific and grows well in the mix usually made up for cymbidiums. Now, my cymbidium mix is out of the bag orchid mix, which I also use for Sarcochilas, funnily enough, and Australian dendrobiums. And yeah, maybe I would use that for Masdevallia. And in fact, I think the first ones I ever bought, I did use that mix. So there you go. And one book just said, don't overpot them. And this book is saying, as the root system becomes quite extensive in good cultivation, plants should not be grown in too small a pot. Oh, growing orchids, plant lovers, everyone has a different opinion about how to do it well. But the repotting advice, though, from this book, I think, is good, which is that repotting should be carried out only in the growing period and just before the plants show new roots. So that is now spring, basically. And what we can see here is at the base of the plant these new growths. So it's just beginning its sort of growth spurt and the new roots are just about to start forming. So in fact, this is a great time to repot everything. So I will look at my other Masdevallia and just see what condition they're in. Now, some have done better than others for me. Some have just had the misfortune of hitting a hot, dry, windy moment and it's withered the flowers. Some have had the misfortune, like some of these leaves, to be really nibbled. Some have had the misfortune to have an insect lay its eggs in the little apex of the leaf there, which has then deformed the leaf as it's grown because the little larva's been munching away. Yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Some have just done brilliantly well. Others just get to flowering. It's either eaten or shriveled or something happens. But in all of these books, it does make reference to the fact that Masdevallia are tricky or difficult. I don't think that's the case. I think you could say that for any orchid until you figure out how to grow it and what the conditions are. Now let's listen to this poetic description of Masdevallia coccinea in its native habitat. Masdevallia coccinea was discovered by Chesterton in 1871 near Sogamoso in Colombia and was introduced to us in the same year. Its principal locality is on the eastern Cordillera between Sogamoso and Concepcion, where its vertical range is 7,000, 10,000 feet, 2,000, 3,000 meters, particularly abundant on that part of the Cordillera called the Sierra Nevada de Chita, where it spreads for miles in uninterrupted masses covering acres upon acres of the upland slopes, growing in the partial shade afforded by the low shrubs that abound in that place. Imagine finding a field of Masdevallia in bloom. Imagine what that would look like, particularly coccinea. I mean, the red or the magenta or the orange version or the white version. How incredible would that look? Now, another Masdevallia was discovered in the Andes, and the explorer noted that he found the plants growing in crevices and hollows in the rocks above the timberline and with almost nothing in which to take root. The best plants growing in the part shade of stunted shrubbery covering the mountains. So there we are, light. So higher altitude, more cloud cover. So it is a bright, often direct light, but it's very protected by the clouds, which is kind of the same effect that you get in a shade house. So it is bright light, but the plant is protected. And in two of those descriptions, the plants are growing in the shade of scrubby shrubs. So dappled light. So really, I think again, there's a notion that it is a low light plant, which to me is not the case because it will not bloom. So tricky because its leaves are delicate and they won't really survive very well if they get direct light, but if it's in too much shade it's not going to bloom for you. So you want to try and create that bright indirect light with a little bit of protection. And as you saw in Dan's shade house, they're basically growing in the same space as his Sarcogylus. So the best spot for mine, in fact the best spot for this one, is it gets actually direct morning light, but it's really early in the morning, so very, very gentle. Then the sun moves over and it's then getting bright indirect light protected by some evergreen trees and then the roof of the space out the back, which is a polycarbonate, so it's transparent, so the light gets through, but they're still protected. So that's kind of perfect. And most of mine are thriving there. As I said, the only setback is if you get the odd really hot blast of weather and insects. So let's talk fertilizer. I generally put a bit of slow release fertilizer on most plants, but this plant, according to this book, Masdevallias do not need as much fertilizer as more vigorous orchids, such as slipper orchids. And the best time to apply weak solutions or moderate amounts of fertilizer is when the leaves are about half grown and new roots or older root activity is noted. So that would be spring. So there you go. Basically, like with many orchids, when it's growing and doing something, you might want to feed it, and when it's not, you don't. So there we are, Masdevallias, plant lovers. They are cool growing. They can take a little bit of heat if they're protected. They do need and like cooler, particularly winter weather. They do need bright indirect light. They do need to be kept moist. Well, moist all the time, but not wet because the roots can rot. And you do need to keep an eye on the medium you've chosen to pot it in, because if it does break down, the roots will be affected quite quickly. You'll see that though in the health of the plant and black tips and discoloration, in which case repot it. Best to do that in spring when you're starting to see a new growth and root action, which is also a good time to feed them. There you go, Masdevallia care in under 1 minute. Now, you might want it to be fragrant, but it's not. Maybe there is a fragrant species. I'm sure someone will tell us. This one isn't. Now, flowering wise, it is spring now. The most common time for them to bloom is at this time of year, but I get sporadic blooms from many of mine throughout the year, which can be tricky because if it is in summer, they are much more likely to get fried on the odd hot day, and there just isn't the capacity for the flower to survive in really, really hot weather. They are affected very quickly by extreme heat. So good thing, bad thing, that it can bloom sporadically. And given all the hybridization that's been going on, more and more common that you'll get flowers kind of whenever the plant feels like it. So there we are, plant lovers. Masdevallia. Thank you, Dan, a year ago for letting me into your grow space. It was very kind of you. It's always great to see how growers in your area are handling plants that you want to have a go at. And then find your own way. I think everything that we've read about all these different techniques and absolute truths that people say about growing plants, you've just got to figure it out for yourself ultimately. There are some non-negotiable points, like for this one, for example, the moisture, because it doesn't have pseudobulbs. But other than that, most things you've got to find out for yourself, which is part of the delight, but also part of the anxiety of growing orchids. But never mind. Let's not talk of anxiety. Let's talk of beauty. This plant is just gorgeous. The last two flowers are about to open for me. I'm very excited. Hopefully my other Masdevallias will perk up. Another one, a hybrid that's pink, is in bloom at the moment, which is lovely. And I'm going to have a good poke about all my other Masdevallias and see how they're going and whether they need to be repotted or not. So I hope wherever you are in the world, if you've got Masdevallias, they are living their best lives, as are you, and I look very much forward to seeing you next week. If you want to know what I'm doing, hit subscribe. I post every Friday, and you'll know then what's going on. But until then, see you next week. Take care.